In the summer of 69 CE, the Roman Empire was burning. 4 emperors had risen and fallen in the space of 18 months. The legions of the Rhine had declared their commander emperor and were marching on Rome. The legions of the Danube were preparing to do the same. The city that had conquered the known world was eating itself alive, and in the corridors of power, among the senators and the generals and the provincial governors who were watching the greatest empire in human history teeter on the edge of collapse, there was a rumor, a prophecy, a piece of intelligence so disturbing that the Roman historian Tacitus, writing several decades later, felt compelled to address it directly in his account of this period. The prophecy said that out of Judea would come the rulers of the world. Tacitus records it, Suetonius records it, Josephus records it. 3 separate Roman and Romano-Jewish historians, writing independently, all mention the same prophecy, all describe it as widely known and widely believed in the Jewish world, and all describe the Roman response to it as ranging from dismissive to genuinely alarmed. And then all 3 of them say something remarkable. All 3 say the prophecy was fulfilled not by a Jewish Messiah, by Vespasian, the Roman general who was besieging Jerusalem when his troops declared him emperor, who left his son Titus to finish the siege, who marched to Rome and became the first emperor of the Flavian dynasty, bringing an end to the year of chaos that had followed Nero's suicide. Rome took a Jewish prophecy about the rulers of the world coming from Judea, applied it to a Roman general, and used it as propaganda to legitimize a new imperial dynasty. This is one of the most extraordinary acts of religious appropriation in the history of the ancient world, and it is almost never discussed in popular accounts of either Roman history or Jewish history. But it is only the beginning of the story, because the prophecy that Rome appropriated was one piece of a much larger prophetic tradition, a tradition so threatening to Roman power that it drove one of the most consequential military campaigns in ancient history, produced the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, scattered the Jewish people across the known world, and set in motion a chain of events that would eventually produce Christianity and Islam and reshape the entire religious landscape of Western civilization. The Jewish prophetic tradition did not merely predict the coming of a Messiah, it predicted the end of Rome, and Rome knew it. Welcome to this channel, where ancient secrets meet modern questions. To understand why Jewish prophecy terrified Rome, you need to understand what Roman imperial ideology actually was, because the conflict between Rome and the Jewish prophetic tradition was not merely a political conflict. It was a conflict between 2 incompatible visions of how history works and where it is going. Roman imperial ideology, at its most developed, was a theology of permanence. Rome was not merely a city or an empire. It was the eternal order of things. The Augustan poets, Virgil above all, had articulated a vision of Rome as the fulfillment of human history, the endpoint toward which all previous civilizations had been building, the final and permanent form of organized human life. Jupiter, the king of the gods, had promised Aeneas, the legendary founder of Rome, that he was giving the Romans empire without end, imperium sine fine. Rome would not fall. Rome could not fall. The idea of Rome's fall was literally unthinkable within the framework of Roman imperial theology. The Jewish prophetic tradition said something completely different. It said that all empires fall, that every power that oppresses the people of God will be destroyed, that history is not moving toward the permanent dominance of any earthly power, but toward a divine intervention that will overturn the existing order entirely and establish a kingdom of God that will replace all human kingdoms forever. The book of Daniel, written in the 2nd century BCE during the persecution of the Jews by the Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, encodes this message in a series of visions that the Jewish community found electrifying, and that Rome, once it inherited the role of imperial oppressor from the Seleucids, found deeply threatening. In Daniel's vision of the great statue made of different metals, a stone not cut by human hands strikes the statue on its feet and destroys it entirely, and the stone becomes a great mountain that fills the whole earth. The interpretation given in the text is explicit. The statue represents successive world empires, and the stone that destroys them is the kingdom that the God of heaven will set up, a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Rome knew it was the feet of iron and clay at the bottom of that statue. Rome knew the Jewish tradition identified the current imperial power, whoever it was, as the final and most corrupt kingdom before the divine intervention. And Rome knew that the Jewish community across Judea and across the diaspora communities scattered throughout the empire was waiting for that intervention, actively, prayerfully, and when the opportunity presented itself, militarily. The scholar N.T. Wright of the University of St. Andrews, one of the most influential New Testament scholars of the past half century, has argued in his landmark series on Christian origins that the entire world of first century Judaism was saturated with a specific kind of hope that he calls the hope for the restoration of Israel, the belief that the story that had begun with Abraham and continued through Moses and David and the prophets was not finished, that God was going to act again in history dramatically and finally to vindicate the Jewish people, defeat their oppressors, restore the Davidic monarchy, rebuild the temple, and establish the kingdom of God on earth. This hope was not a vague spiritual aspiration. It was a concrete political expectation with military implications. The first century Jewish world produced multiple messianic movements, multiple figures who gathered followers by presenting themselves as the instrument of divine liberation, and multiple armed revolts against Roman power that Rome put down with increasingly brutal force. The revolt of 66 to 70 CE, which ended with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, was the largest and most catastrophic of these revolts, but it was not the last. The revolt of Bar Kokhba from 132 to 135 CE, which the Rabbi Akiva, one of the most revered figures in the entire history of Judaism, identified as the Messianic War, ended with the Romans killing or enslaving most of the remaining Jewish population of Judea, renaming the province Syria Palestina to erase the Jewish connection to the land, and prohibiting Jews from entering Jerusalem on pain of death. Rome did not spend this much blood and treasure suppressing a theological disagreement. Rome was responding to what it correctly understood as an existential political threat encoded in a religious language that the entire Jewish world took with deadly seriousness. But to understand the specific content of the prophecy that most terrified Rome, we need to go deeper into the prophetic tradition itself, because the popular understanding of Jewish messianism is significantly impoverished compared to the actual richness and diversity of what the first century Jewish world believed was coming. The word Messiah, from the Hebrew Mashiach, means anointed one. In the Hebrew Bible, it is used of priests, of kings, and even of the Persian king, Cyrus the Great, who is called God's anointed in the book of Isaiah because he authorized the return of the Jews from Babylonian exile. The word does not in the Hebrew Bible refer to a single specific future figure. It describes a category, the anointed one, which could be applied to various figures in various contexts. By the first century CE, the concept had developed in multiple directions simultaneously. The Psalms of Solomon, a first century BCE Jewish text not included in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, describes a coming king from the line of David who will purify Jerusalem, drive out the Gentile oppressors, gather the scattered tribes of Israel, and rule over a kingdom of righteousness. This is the warrior king Messiah, the son of David, the figure whose military and political dimensions are front and center. The Dead Sea Scrolls describe not one Messiah, but two, a priestly Messiah of Aaron and a royal Messiah of Israel. The priestly Messiah takes precedence over the royal one, reflecting the community's priestly orientation and its belief that the restoration of true temple worship was at least as important as the restoration of the Davidic monarchy. The Book of Enoch, which we have discussed in previous videos, describes a figure called the Son of Man, a heavenly being who sits on the throne of God's glory, before whom the kings and the powerful of the earth fall on their faces, who judges the nations and vindicates the righteous. This is not a political or military figure. This is a cosmic figure, a being of supernatural authority whose intervention in human history is not a military campaign but a divine judgment. Daniel's vision of the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven is the most concentrated expression of this cosmic messianism in the Hebrew Bible. And it is this figure more than the warrior king of the Psalms of Solomon that appears to have been the primary reference point for the Jesus movement's understanding of who Jesus was. The Synoptic Gospels record Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man repeatedly using the Danielic language, and the high priest at his trial understands immediately what is being claimed. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. The high priest tears his clothes. This is blasphemy, he says. And he is responding not to a vague spiritual claim, but to a specific and explosive appropriation of the most politically charged messianic language in the entire Jewish tradition. Here is something that almost nobody in popular religious discussion ever addresses directly. Rome's fear of Jewish prophecy was not irrational paranoia. It was based on an accurate reading of what the Jewish prophetic tradition actually said and on an accurate assessment of the political consequences when people took that tradition seriously. The Jewish prophetic tradition, at its most developed, predicted the following sequence of events. The current world order, which in the first century meant Roman imperial domination, would collapse in a period of unprecedented catastrophe, what the rabbinic tradition calls the birth pangs of the Messiah. Out of that catastrophe, a messianic figure would emerge who would defeat the enemies of Israel, restore the Davidic monarchy in the temple, gather the scattered Jewish people from across the diaspora, and establish a kingdom of God that would be recognized by all the nations of the earth. The nations that had oppressed Israel would be judged. The nations that had respected Israel would be welcomed into the new order. And this new order would be permanent, eternal, the final chapter of human history. This is not a prophecy about personal spiritual transformation. It is a prophecy about the replacement of the Roman Empire with a theocracy centered in Jerusalem. Rome read it correctly, and Rome responded accordingly. The Roman response to Jewish messianism across the 1st and 2nd centuries was systematic and escalating. The execution of Jesus of Nazareth was, in the Roman framework, a straightforward political execution of a potential messianic pretender. The crucifixion was the standard Roman method of execution for political rebels and slaves. The inscription placed on the cross, "The King of the Jews," was simultaneously a mockery and a statement of the charge. This man claimed a political title that Rome did not authorize and could not tolerate. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 CE was not a punitive expedition against a rebellious province in the ordinary sense. It was a deliberate and systematic attempt to eliminate the physical and institutional basis for Jewish messianic expectation. Without a temple, there could be no temple-centered messianism. Without Jerusalem, there could be no Davidic restoration centered in Jerusalem. Without the Sanhedrin and the high priesthood, there could be no institutional religious authority to validate a messianic claim. Rome was not merely suppressing a revolt. It was attempting to destroy the theological infrastructure that made revolt conceivable. The Emperor Titus carried the temple menorah and other sacred vessels in his triumph through Rome, and they are depicted on the Arch of Titus to this day as a deliberate statement. The God of the Jews has been defeated. The instruments of his worship are our trophies. The prophecies that predicted Roman defeat have been answered by Roman victory. It did not work. Within 2 generations, the Bar Kokhba revolt had broken out, more catastrophic than the first, driven by the same messianic expectation that the destruction of the temple had been intended to extinguish. And Rabbi Akiva, who identified Bar Kokhba as the Messiah based on a verse from the book of Numbers, "A star shall come out of Jacob," was not a fringe figure promoting a peripheral belief. He was the most respected Torah scholar of his generation, and his endorsement of Bar Kokhba as the Messianic king reflects just how alive and how urgent the Messianic hope remained, even after the catastrophe of 70 CE. The Romans put down the Bar Kokhba revolt with extraordinary violence. Contemporary estimates of the Jewish death toll range from hundreds of thousands to over 500,000. The historian Cassius Dio, writing in the early 3rd century, describes the Romans demolishing 50 fortresses and 985 villages, killing 580,000 in battle, with uncountable numbers, dying of disease and fire, so that almost the whole of Judea was made desolate. This is almost certainly an exaggeration, but the scale of the Roman response reflects just how seriously Rome took the threat that Jewish messianic expectation represented. And then Rome did something that no military campaign could do: it converted. The Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century is one of the most consequential events in the history of Western civilization, and it is directly relevant to the story of Jewish prophecy and Roman fear, because Christianity, the movement that began as one more Jewish messianic movement among many in first century Judea, had developed in the period between the death of Jesus and the Constantinian conversion into something that addressed the Roman fear of Jewish prophecy in an extraordinarily sophisticated way. The Christian theological move, worked out in letters and gospels and councils across 3 centuries, was essentially this: the Jewish prophecies are all true. The Messiah has come. The kingdom of God has been established. But the fulfillment looks different from what the Jewish tradition expected, because the Messiah who came was not a warrior king who defeated Rome militarily, but a suffering servant who defeated death spiritually, whose kingdom is not of this world, whose restoration of Israel is the gathering of a new Israel that includes all nations who believe in him. This move simultaneously validated the Jewish prophetic tradition, which gave it enormous appeal to a Gentile world that had been exposed to that tradition through the diaspora synagogues, and diffused its revolutionary political implications. If the kingdom of God that the prophets foretold is a spiritual kingdom established in the heart of the believer, then Roman imperial power is not threatened by it. Caesar can remain Caesar while God has what belongs to God. This was a theological solution to a political problem, and it was extraordinarily effective. By the time Constantine converted, Christianity had developed from a Jewish messianic movement that Rome had every reason to suppress into a theological system that Rome had every reason to embrace, precisely because it had spiritualized the revolutionary prophecies that the Jewish tradition had kept in their most politically dangerous form. The scholar Reza Aslan of the University of California, in his controversial but widely read book, Zealot: The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, has argued that the historical Jesus was considerably closer to the warrior Messiah tradition than the canonical Gospels present him, that his movement had real revolutionary political ambitions, and that the spiritual and otherworldly Christ of Christian theology is a later development driven precisely by the need to make the Jesus movement acceptable to a Roman audience. This is a minority scholarly position and a highly contested one. But the basic observation that the Christology of the Nicene Creed is considerably further from the political messianism of first century Judaism than the Jesus of the earliest gospel sources is one that mainstream New Testament scholarship largely accepts. Here is what the Roman fear of Jewish prophecy reveals about the nature of the prophecy itself. Prophecy, in the Jewish tradition, is not primarily about prediction. It is primarily about interpretation. The prophets of ancient Israel were not fortune tellers who announced specific future events. They were interpreters of the present who claimed to speak from the perspective of God about what the current situation meant and where it was going. Their fundamental claim was not, "I know what will happen." Their fundamental claim was, "I know what is really happening. I can see the moral and spiritual dimensions of the current situation that are invisible to those embedded in it." And the moral claim that the prophetic tradition made about Rome, the same claim it had made about Babylon and Assyria and Egypt before Rome, was simply this: power exercised through violence and exploitation and the crushing of the weak is not the final word about human history. It may look permanent, it may look inevitable, it may look like the natural order of things, like something that will never change, but it will change. Because the God who created history is on the side of the poor and the oppressed and the defeated, and the empires that built their power on the suffering of the weak are building on sand. This is the prophecy that terrified Rome, not a specific prediction about a specific military event, but a fundamental claim about the moral structure of history. a claim that Rome's power was not legitimate, that Rome's permanence was an illusion, that the eternal order that Roman imperial theology proclaimed was not eternal at all, but contingent and temporary and subject to the judgment of a power that Rome could not defeat because Rome could not even see it. Rome was right to be terrified, not because the Jewish prophetic tradition produced a military threat that Rome could not handle. The Jewish armies were no match for the Roman legions, but because the Jewish prophetic tradition produced something far more dangerous than an army. It produced a way of seeing the world that made Roman power look temporary and unjust and doomed. And that vision, once it existed in the world, could not be destroyed by military force because it lived not in buildings or armies or institutions, but in the minds and hearts and shared memory of a people. Every empire that has ever tried to destroy the Jewish people has discovered this. You can burn the temple. You can scatter the people. You can rename the land. You can kill the prophets. And the vision survives because the vision is not located in any of those things. The vision is located in the text, and the text travels with the people wherever they go. And here is the deepest irony of the entire story. Rome's attempt to destroy Jewish messianism produced, through a chain of events that nobody in the first century could have predicted, the religion that eventually conquered Rome from within. The execution of Jesus of Nazareth, Rome's attempt to eliminate one more messianic pretender, produced a movement that would, within 3 centuries, replace the Roman imperial religion entirely. The destruction of the temple, Rome's attempt to eliminate the institutional basis for Jewish messianic expectation, produced the diaspora communities and the rabbinic tradition that would carry Jewish prophetic thought across the entire known world. The persecution of the early Christians, Rome's attempt to suppress the movement before it could grow, produced the martyrs whose willingness to die rather than deny their faith made the movement more attractive, not less, to a Roman world that had grown weary of a religion that offered nothing worth dying for. Rome won every battle and lost the war, exactly as the prophets said it would. The prophecy that out of Judea would come the rulers of the world was fulfilled. Not in the way Vespasian imagined when he applied it to himself, and not in the way the Jewish tradition imagined when it looked for a warrior king from the line of David. It was fulfilled in the way that history tends to fulfill its most important prophecies, obliquely, unexpectedly, in forms that nobody recognized until long after the fact, and in ways that raised as many questions as they answered. Out of Judea came the rulers of the Western world, not soldiers, not kings, words. And the words proved more durable than the legions and the stone walls and the gold of the empire that tried to silence them. Here is the question I want to leave you with, the one worth arguing about, worth thinking about at 3 a.m, worth disagreeing with everyone you know over. If the prophetic tradition was right that Rome would fall, and Rome fell, does that mean the other things the prophetic tradition predicted are also coming? The restoration of Israel, the gathering of the scattered, the final judgment, the kingdom that has no end? Or does the fulfillment of the Rome prophecy tell us something more uncomfortable? That every generation reads the prophetic tradition through the lens of its own fears and hopes and enemies, and finds in it the confirmation it needs, and that the prophecy endures not because it predicts specific events with supernatural accuracy, but because it articulates something permanently true about the moral structure of power and the ultimate vulnerability of everything built on. Injustice? Both of those answers are in the tradition. Both of them have been argued over for 2,000 years. Neither of them has won. And the argument continues, which may be exactly what the prophets intended. In the next video, we are going to look at the figure who stands at the center of the Jewish prophetic tradition and who has been more misunderstood, more misrepresented, and more politically exploited than any other figure in the history of Western religion. a man who wore a camel hair garment and ate locusts and wild honey and preached in the desert and baptized in the Jordan River and was executed by a king who was afraid of him. A man whom Jesus called the greatest human being who had ever lived. A man whom the Mandaeans worship as their primary prophet, whom the Quran honors as a prophet of God, whom some Dead Sea Scrolls scholars have identified with the teacher of righteousness at Qumran. His name is John the Baptist. And what he was actually doing in that desert, who sent him, what tradition he represented, and why he frightened everyone from Herod Antipas to the Jerusalem temple establishment to Rome itself, is a story that nobody has ever fully told.